we're going to be talking about the Great Society, both what it was and also philosophical justifications that were proposed for it. Let's start out with the presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson, whose presidential library is right here on campus, and whose power base really was Central Texas. He was a congressman and then a senator. One of the things he achieved was in the 1930s bringing electricity and flood control to Central Texas. Helped him to build his power base here. He ended up having a long career, both as a congressman and then as a senator, then as Kennedy's vice president, and finally as president. Here he is shaking hands with Dwight Eisenhower. Johnson was famous for his ability to enact legislation. Kennedy was in many ways an inspiring president. I think even in many ways a very good president. But he did not actually have much effectiveness in working with Congress. He was not good at translating ideas into actual legislation and actual programs. Johnson was. In fact, I'm not sure I can think of any president who was so effective. Maybe FDR in his first 100 days. But another president was so effective throughout his term at actually enacting the legislation that he proposed. Johnson understood how the House of Representatives worked, having served there for 12 years. Also how the Senate worked, having served there for 12 years. He was also just an immensely powerful personality. He would give people what was known as the treatment. Here he is giving it to this fellow. It is scary. Here he is. Someone else who was not cooperating. But he could also be very kind if you were cooperating. So, you know, if you were on his side, it was like, hey, friend. And if you weren't, it was kind of like, dude, what's the deal? And so he was somebody who actually was, here he is with Thurgood Marshall on the Supreme Court. Here he is with Martin Luther King Jr. And here he is standing in front of the statue of Abraham Lincoln. He was somebody who excelled at articulating an ideal, but also, in practical terms, crafting legislation that went along with that ideal and put it into practice, and then getting it through both houses of Congress. Unfortunately, he also was plagued by the Vietnam War. And, in fact, in 1964, in November, Johnson was re-elected in a landslide, but also in August 1964, something happened that seemed like a minor event at the time, but turned out not to be minor at all. North Vietnam attacked American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. There's a lot of historical controversy about exactly what happened, but that at any rate was how it was reported, and how I think a majority of historians still think it happened. In any case, Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, authorizing the use of force against North Vietnam. And that really led to a major American involvement in the Vietnam War. Up to this point, Eisenhower had sent a few military advisors. Kennedy had sent many more military advisors, had started extensive training of South Vietnamese forces, but it was really under Johnson that American troops, American airplanes, and ships got involved in Vietnam. Here is one of the ships that were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. And here is Johnson campaigning in 1964, very successfully against Barry Goldwater. Here he is consoling Goldwater after his loss. And here, this shows you just how dramatic the win was. Arizona, Goldwater's home state, went for him, and some far southern states did. Everything else went for Johnson. And here it is county by county, where you can see it's, if anything, even more dramatic. Well, 1964 saw lots of other things. The advent of the Beatles in the United States, for example, which I remember being a very big deal. Though I confess I didn't get it. I was one of those nerds who was always in the library. I mean, I was in elementary school, right? But I'm still a nerd. Or even then a nerd. Even in first grade. Actually, I just got sent to the library all the time. I don't know what it was about me. But teachers would try to teach me, and they would finally say, look, why don't you just leave? Go to the library. And so I just did. I spent most of first grade and most of sixth grade just hanging out in the library. Because the teacher would just say, yeah, go away. Which was awesome. I loved going away. Anyway, but yeah, so, well, never mind. In any event, Johnson vastly increased spending on social programs. The administration today, here and now, he announced, declares unconditional war on poverty. Jack Kemp later quipped, we fought a war on poverty and the poor lost. But in any case, we'll get to that. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 extended the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960, was much more extensive. The Voting Rights Act followed the next year, 1965. The Equal Opportunity Act that same year. There was an Elementary and Secondary Education Act that for the first time had federal funding and federal programs geared to lower education, that is to say, below the college level. There was the Medicare Act, establishing the system of Medicare for medical care for the elderly. There was the Rent Supplement Act that helped people with housing. And as we'll talk about later, there was also an Immigration and Nationality Act that greatly changed the pattern of immigration to the United States. In any case, that's a remarkable record of legislative achievement. He was able to establish the Great Society programs on a very firm foundation, and usually with bipartisan majorities. One of the things that Johnson was very good at is working with both parties in Congress. The Democrats did have a significant majority, but he was concerned not to pass things like Medicare or other things without large bipartisan majorities. And in fact, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were passed primarily by the Republicans in Congress. A majority of Democrats voted against them. But Johnson was very good at working with Republicans as well as Democrats to get these programs approved. Here he is signing, for example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Martin Luther King right there in the background. Here he is signing, actually, then I think he's just giving them the pen immediately afterwards. Here he is signing the Immigration Act in 1965. You see Robert Kennedy here sort of smiling oddly. That's Ted Kennedy. That's Lady Bird Johnson, Hubert Humphrey, his vice president. Oh, and the location there, that's New York Harbor. So if you were situated correctly, which the photographer was not, you would get the Statue of Liberty in the shot. Actually, this, I guess, was the base of the Statue of Liberty, so that would have been hard. In any case, the 1960s did see a dramatic change in the role of government in the United States. Vietnam pushed defense spending higher, but that turned out to be a temporary phenomenon. Domestic entitlement spending, things like Medicare, Medicaid later, and so on, began a lasting pattern of increase. And so if you look at the pattern of spending before this, the federal government mostly was concerned with national defense, also with the administration of justice within the United States, and a few other things, but really its primary obligation was to protect people from harm, either from external harm from the outside or from internal harms. However, this idea of guaranteeing people's welfare changed people's conception of government. So here is what happened with defense spending. As you can see, it was dramatically high, over a third of federal spending during the Second World War. It was about 12% during the Korean War, reached a high of almost 9% in Vietnam, but since then there's been a pretty steady decline, and now it's under 5%. Entitlement spending, on the other hand, has gone up dramatically. Here it is in 1965. This blue line tracks real gross domestic product. So that's just in general how the society has been doing. And you can see entitlement expenses soaring relative to that. So the overall pattern has been this. If you look at what makes up federal spending, in 1962, it was mostly defense. Then a little bit for Social Security, a little bit for anti-poverty programs, some interest payments, and then other things. By the end of the 1960s, defense was declining rapidly, Social Security and Medicare increasing rapidly, other anti-poverty programs increasing, and today you can see defense spending is only about 14% of federal spending. These two categories combined make up fully half of it. Now, well, that's just defense against entitlement spending in a couple of graphs that show the general trend starting in the 60s. There were other trends that began in the 1960s dramatically. SAT scores have dropped nearly 60 points since then. The high point was right around 1970. Then actually my high school class came in right here, and as you can see, we started a long pattern of decline. By 1980, American students were basically idiots, but there's been some improvement since then. I'm joking, they're not idiots, but gosh, they're not as smart as we were. Anyway, poverty rates have dropped, well, were dropping dramatically. Up until when? Up until about 1968. And then, suddenly, both for whites and for African Americans, things leveled out, and we haven't made much progress in poverty until, well, the 1990s, when there began to be a slight decline for whites, a more dramatic decline for Latinos and African Americans. So the war on poverty, well, was enacted right around here, so it was actually just at the tail end of that decline. And it's interesting to ask, what on earth happened? By various measures of inequality, there's been a dramatic increase in inequality since the 1960s. Here we see 1965, as you can see, all of the lines have shot up significantly since then, and here's a different measure that shows inequality at a relatively low level in the 50s and 60s, and then increasing dramatically in the 70s and later. Now, all of those are simply facts. The question is really, how do you explain them? What on earth is going on there? We'll come back to that question. Although Johnson's main initiative was really domestic, he did get involved increasingly in the Vietnam War, which grew into a greater and greater American commitment until finally in 1968 it led him not to seek re-election. Why? Well, he started a campaign of bombing in 1965. The Joint Chiefs told him that victory in Vietnam would take about 7 years and almost 1 million men. He didn't like that answer. He didn't want to be committed to a 7-year war. He didn't want to commit 1 million troops to Southeast Asia. And so his strategy was incremental. It was full of moral restraints. If you think about war strategy in general, there are different approaches to this. I think last time I mentioned Sun Tzu, who had this idea in The Art of War that you should really just gently tilt things toward your side and try to get your objectives without fighting at all. The best general, Sun Tzu said, is the one who never has to fight. The chief modern theorist of war was Karl von Clausewitz. His basic premise is that war is terrible, and you want it to end as quickly as possible. So the thing to do, the moral thing to do, as well as the strategic thing to do, is to fight to win as quickly as possible. So to fight with a great deal of effort, not at all ambiguously, but to aiming at total victory as quickly as possible. Fight with full force, no holds barred. That really, in the end, sounds immoral, he said, but in fact it's the most moral thing. Because war is terrible, however you conduct it, better to get it over with quickly. Well, Johnson's attitude was really the opposite of Clausewitz. It wasn't really this Eisenhower-esque Sun Tzu, let's just gently tilt the battlefields, hoping that we won't have to even fight. That suggested just supply military advisors and that type of thing, indirect support. It wasn't Clausewitz's idea of win as quickly as possible with overwhelming force. Instead, it was to increase troop strength incrementally. Send over, let's say, a few thousand troops, see how they do. Then if you need more, send in a few more, and so on. A bombing campaign, don't launch a devastating bombing campaign. Bomb here and there, and then pause and see what happens, and so on. There should be limited bombing to protect civilians. Pauses in the bombing to see if the bombing is having the effect and can spur the other side to negotiations. He refused to bomb anti-aircraft batteries under construction. He thought that was unfair somehow. You had to let the other side have guns to try to shoot you down. I gotta admit, I don't understand that one. It seems to me very odd to say, oh, you're building guns that will keep us from attacking you. Yeah, we have to let you do that. And finally, he had rules of engagement that basically said, look, you cannot attack unless you are attacked. And in fact, one of the frustrations of people who actually fought in Vietnam is that these rules of engagement led to frequent and contradictory orders. Take that hill. So people attack the hill, take the hill, then the next week, retreat. Pull back from the hill. The next week, take that village on the other side of the hill, which means you have to take the hill again. Okay, take that village. No, abandon that village. The lines have shifted, and so on. And so it was very frustrating to troops who were there. Now, yeah, well actually, before I get to that, Johnson did this for a reason. It's not that he was a stupid military strategist, though this is not the best military strategy, it seems to me. He was very concerned with the moral corruption that war brings. Like Churchill, he saw that war is filled with moral ambiguities. It tempts people to behave in ways that are more and more monstrous, and so he didn't want to do that. He wanted to conduct a war morally, and so his goal was really to try to operate under very careful constraints. Those constraints, however, instead of being perceived as moral, actually were perceived as a sign of weakness. Not just by the enemy, though definitely by the enemy, but also by the international community that took it as a sign that the United States really didn't believe in the cause. In any case, Paul Johnson, a historian, has argued that self-imposed restraints like this by a civilized power are worse than useless. They're interpreted by friend and foe alike as evidence not of humanity, but of guilt and a lack of righteous conviction. In any case, the United States did lose the propaganda battle. At the beginning, most people in the United States, and even internationally, thought that the cause was just. North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese forces did attack American warships in the Gulf of Tonkin, and so it seemed like a just fight, although one that John Quincy Adams, for example, would have restrained from fighting, saying, look, our vital interests are not really involved in Southeast Asia. But that had been expanded enough that people thought this was a legitimate thing to do. However, as time went on, more and more people internationally and in the United States began losing faith in the war. Finally, by the 1970s, one prominent moral philosopher was able to say this was a criminal war criminally conducted. And what he meant was there was no just cause for going to war, and moreover, once we went to war, we conducted the war in a highly unjust way. Now, well, how you think about this depends on how you think about the war in general. And we can see a turning point with the Tet Offensive in December of 1968. It was a major offensive launched by the North Vietnamese against Saigon, primarily, really across a very broad front in South Vietnam, but the goal was to capture Saigon. Here you see American troops defending a city behind this wall. Here you see some civilians and some enemy Viet Cong soldiers killed and others fleeing. And here is a map that shows you the extent of the offensive. All of those red arrows were points of attack and launched really from typically Laos and Cambodia, where they were, in a sense, inaccessible to American forces, across the border to attack South Vietnamese units and American units. It was a huge military victory for the United States, a vast military victory. All across that front, American forces repelled the attacks with devastating losses to the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. But it was reported in the United States as just the opposite. Instead, night after night on the TV news, you saw images of this. You saw dead American soldiers. You saw reports of how many had been killed that day. And really, from my own childhood, this was a sort of standard thing. You turn on the TV that night to find out 167 American soldiers killed today. And so on and so forth, day after day after day. A major offensive like this, those numbers suddenly went up. So the American public became convinced that actually the forces against us were overwhelming, that North Vietnam was still strong enough to pose a serious threat. And so Walter Cronkite famously gave up his support for the Vietnam War. LBJ is reported to have said, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. There is a bit of historical controversy about whether that really happened or whether that's sort of an urban legend. I guess a Washington, D.C. urban legend. But in any case, some people dispute this and say, look, that never really happened, and so on. But it did indicate that right around this point, American public opinion started to shift against the war. Well, something like this started happening even with respect to domestic policies. The passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, the various other components of the Great Society, was actually followed by an increase in social unrest. There were protests. Some of them aimed to enforce the new law, but others are much harder to understand. So as an example of the first sort of protest, we see the March on Selma in 1965, where Martin Luther King is leading this to try to actually force people to enforce the law. But we also see, for example, Watts, an area of Los Angeles, burning, 1965. The aftermath. Detroit, 1967. There it is from the air. Washington, D.C., 1968. This was just following the assassination of Martin Luther King. I was on an airplane, actually, over Washington in April of 1968, and I remember seeing almost exactly that scene. Here was Washington, 1968, from ground level. So there was a tremendous amount of unrest. Now, what was going on? Why? What explains that reaction? There were also campus protests against the Vietnam War and so on, and so this was not the only dimension of this kind of civil unrest, but this didn't seem to have anything to do with Vietnam. How can it be explained? Well, do you have any ideas? If it had happened before the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and so on, you could say, I can explain it easily. Great injustice, right? And people are demanding a change in the law. They're demanding equality. They're demanding an end to discrimination. But those laws, in fact, had been passed. So how do you explain that outburst of unrest after the passage of the law? Yes?
The laws may not have all been enforced very strongly. and like there's still like a strong presence of feeling of like inequality.
Okay, good. Here's one explanation. The laws were passed, but having the laws passed, and number one, having them enforced, and number two, having that actually have an impact on people's actual opportunities and welfare and life, those are different things. And so it's quite possible that in certain areas, especially in the Deep South, enforcement of this was difficult and required years. But also it's possible that even where it was being enforced, the effects of this were not so dramatic as people thought they would be. I tell you all of a sudden, hey, listen, you're all free to become astronauts, whereas before you were prohibited from that. And actually, that might not help you much if you're not in a position to become an astronaut, right? And so for this to actually get to the level where it changes people's lives, that can be a surprisingly long process. And it can produce frustration. Wait, you've guaranteed me equal rights, but I still have the education I have, and I still have the profession I have, and wait a minute, how exactly does this change my life? It does eventually, but it's a slower process than you might think. Can you think of other possible explanations? Yeah?
Resentment from like people who aren't enforcing the law in general?
Well, resentment, yes. Now, actually, it's easy. This is one of the odd things about this. Look at where these things are taking place, right? Los Angeles, Detroit, Washington. The marches in the South to enforce the law actually were peaceful. I can't remember any violent protests, really, throughout the South, whereas the ones in the North tended to be violent. And so maybe it's that people in Detroit were angry that this wasn't being enforced in Alabama, but it's sort of weird. So I agree that might be a thing, but it's like, why were they here? Now, of course, that leads to a thought, well, wait a minute. In Los Angeles, it was really because of perceived police brutality. In Washington in 1968, it was because of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. In Detroit, it was because of, actually, I forget what was the cause of the Detroit riots immediately. But in all cases, there were specific events that actually triggered the uprising. And so one possible explanation is to just say, look, tensions were high, and it was just a bunch of different things. There was no one explanation for it all. There was that explanation in Los Angeles, that one in Detroit, that one in Washington, and so on. And the background was, yes, frustration together with a sense that this wasn't really being enforced, that it wasn't really changing people's lives, and so it was easy for minor events to get blown up into major crises. Other explanations?
Maybe things were going too fast. Like people couldn't adjust to it so easily.
Okay, maybe people were, maybe things were going too fast and people couldn't adjust to it that easily. Adjustment to social change is hard, and if things are changing quickly, there can be forces on the one side that are opposing the change, but there can also be a sense of tension between those who are trying to implement the change and just, well, perceived forces that are holding them back. So yeah, that can be something that leads to heightened tensions. Anyway, people have offered a number of different possible explanations for this. One is that the laws increased expectations that weren't met immediately. Changing people's real opportunities and bringing about equality is something that takes a generation or more. It doesn't happen overnight. So there was a disappointment at the slow pace of change. There were also unintended incentives, you might argue, not to do certain things. This is not really due to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but you might argue that various other anti-poverty programs actually broke apart, for example, black families. Even at the time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a Democratic senator from New York, and a variety of others were concerned at the effects of these programs on families. Often it paid people, literally, to break up their marriages or not to get married. And so, in fact, it started a pattern of change, initially in black families, but now it's spread far beyond the African-American community in the United States, which has changed family structures dramatically. Between 1962 and 1968, there were dramatic changes in family structures, where in inner cities, a typical household, which would have involved a mom and a dad and kids, suddenly involved only a mom and kids. And that's a dramatic sort of social change that has all sorts of other effects. And so if people now have a disincentive to work or to, for that matter, hire people, because you might say, look, suddenly a minority hire was a potential lawsuit, whereas before it was just a good deal. That's something that could have a disincentive, so it might actually harm people's opportunities. It might give families the wrong sorts of incentives. Also, if you look at the pattern, declines in poverty were pretty dramatic up to this point, but all of a sudden they stopped. Now, it's not clear why they stopped. That's a separate question. But you might say, look, in part this was a response not just to not much improvement as a result of the laws, but actually the improvement that had been taking place largely leveled off and stopped happening. Now, why? That's an important question, but you might say part of the frustration here is that things had been improving up to this point. You would think that the changes in the law would improve things even more rapidly. Instead, the changes stopped, and things largely got frozen where they were. And that's a puzzling result. Now, it's not a result really in all segments of society. In a lot of segments, actually, the result of these laws was a dramatic improvement. But in some segments of society, and especially in inner cities, it really led to a kind of status quo. It led to improvements ceasing rather than accelerating. Well, there's one final factor, which is the change in immigration laws, which happened in 1965, led to a very large increase in the number of people coming into the United States, especially from Latin America, and primarily people who were not high-skilled. And so you might argue that the reason, I'm not sure it's the only reason, but perhaps a contributing reason to the fact that poverty stopped declining is that suddenly there was a large mass of low-wage workers competing with existing low-wage workers for jobs. And so that increase in the number of people seeking those jobs may well have had a significant effect. In any case, whatever we should think, and it's probably some combination of all these factors and ones people haven't thought of yet, it might be a mistake to think of this sort of unrest as tied specifically to anything I've mentioned at all. After all, at the same time, May 1968, were riots in Paris, where student demonstrators and others took to the streets and battled police in a way that was at least as dramatic as anything that had took place in the United States. Here you see the aftermath of one of the riots. A Parisian woman walking by determinedly against a wreckage of cars piled in the background. And also in 1968, there were riots at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. This seemed to have nothing in particular to do with civil rights, nothing directly to do with the Vietnam War. It's not clear what it had to do with, actually, but it was significant, and actually the filming of that on TV and broadcast throughout the nation may have contributed to Richard Nixon's victory in the election that year. So whatever was going on, it was taking place, yes, in part in inner cities in response to civil rights type issues, but also on campuses in response to the Vietnam War, also in Paris, in Chicago, in a variety of other places for reasons that seem to have nothing to do with either of those. So it's a large-scale phenomenon that deserves, I think, further examination. It all ended roughly in 1970 with the Kent State shooting, where there was a Vietnam War protest at Kent State University. 4 students were shot and killed by the National Guard. And here is a famous photograph of that incident.